Is starting. Greetings. This is Town Hall Thursdays with Darryl W. Perry, and I'm joined by Nicholas Sarwark. Nick is, of course, the chairman of the Libertarian Party, national chairman. Not sure for how much longer you'll be chair. It's either a week or
it's going to be a week.
Years, who knows? But we're not here to talk about the internal politics of the Libertarian Party. Although we might delve into the lawsuit that has gotten a little bit of media attention in the last couple of days, but specifically I want to talk about your race for county attorney and a little bit why you're running. What exactly does the county attorney do? Like I know that the county attorney is kind of the chief prosecutor, but a lot of voters don't really know exactly what the county attorney does, how much power they have. Plus there's been a little bit of controversy specifically in Hillsborough County where you're running.
Yeah, I think you sort of started with the reason at the end, which is, our family relocated to New Hampshire last summer. We're coming up on a year as Granite Staters now, and just got a house. We're about to close later this month. And so we're really settling in, and whenever you move to a new place, you try and make it your home. So I watch the news, I keep track of what's happening here in Manchester and New Hampshire generally. And I saw the stories about, county attorney's office gets taken over. And I thought, wow, that's interesting, because in New Hampshire, the constitutional structure is such that the county attorneys for the various counties technically work under the authority of the attorney general. Now, as a matter of course, they're elected by the voters of their county. They're given the autonomy to do their jobs as they see fit as officers of the court and elected officials. But what had happened, the current county attorney had gotten elected in 2018 without having ever practiced criminal law on either side of the process, which is odd to me that a county attorney, you would even run for an elected prosecutor office without having at least some familiarity with criminal law. I guess that led to some plea deals that he didn't justify well enough to the police chiefs. They all went to the attorney general's office, tried to get him removed. When that didn't work, they sent an assistant AG down to basically supervise the day-to-day operations of the office. And a county attorney, when you're an elected county attorney, it's a little different than just being a guy who goes into court and prosecutes people. You're responsible for the policies, the hiring, the training, the negotiations with the private defense bar and the public defender's offices, relationships with law enforcement agencies, and the various municipalities that are inside the county. You do a lot that isn't just going to court. And what they did was basically take over all of that stuff, the hiring, the firing, the approval of plea deals for any serious felony. And that's not an ideal situation for Hillsborough County to be in, regardless of whether I'm in this race or not. It's best to have your county attorney be somebody who was elected by the people, responsible for them, and the values that they ran on are the ones that should apply in making prosecutorial decisions in the county. And so I realized that, the existing county attorney wasn't really competent for the office, or at least had a long way to go towards competency. I think they did just let him off of direct supervision maybe a week or so ago. So he's all good. And it was a place where I had the life experience and the background necessary to do a good job in the office. I spent 5 years as a deputy public defender in Arapahoe County, Colorado, in a very busy trial office that got a lot of high profile cases. And I'm very familiar with, the law and how an office is administered and how to foster good relationships in the criminal justice system. And it was an opportunity to serve the community that we moved to.
Now, let's talk a little bit about your experience, because I know that right after you filed, one of the Republicans that has filed for that office as well, not the nominee yet because he has to go through a primary. He made a post about one of the candidates isn't even admitted to the New Hampshire bar. In reference to you, you filed your paperwork to be admitted to the bar, but how many states have you practiced And
So my first law license is in the state of Colorado. That's where I moved after law school and took a position as a deputy state public defender. I later relocated to Arizona in 2014 and was admitted to the bar there and also the Federal District of Arizona. New Hampshire has reciprocity with both Colorado and Arizona, and so I qualify in multiple ways actually for admission on motion. I filed that paperwork. That application is pending with the general counsel there in Concord, and I anticipate it'll get reviewed either later this month or in 2 or 3 months. They do periodic reviews of admissions on motion, but there shouldn't be any problem. I don't have any disciplinary history. I've successfully practiced in multiple jurisdictions, passed multiple character and fitness things. It's more of a formality than anything. And the requirement to be a member of the New Hampshire bar is when you take the office. What the affidavit you sign is that you'll be qualified upon receiving the office. And at the point where I would be elected, I will also have been admitted.
excellent. So more than qualified. And you mentioned a little bit, not directly related to criminal justice reform per se, but since the attorney, and I know in most places they refer to them as district attorneys.
Right.
So if I use the term, it's not, intentional. It's just what most people are familiar, most people outside of New Hampshire. Anyway, are familiar with the term district attorney.
Right.
So they do have some sort of leeway on whom to offer plea deals to, correct?
Yeah. So when you're a prosecutor, the criminal justice system, you have prosecutors and you have defense attorneys.
Yep.
And in our system in the United States, individuals don't get to be prosecutors. Only the state is allowed to be the prosecutor. That's kind of the system of justice we have and have had since the founding. We don't have private prosecution.
That's why when I have a parking ticket or speeding ticket or anything else, it is state v. Darryl W. Perry.
Exactly. So they act on behalf of the state as the prosecutor, and their job, their ethics require that they're to do justice, right? And so it's a very broad ambit that an elected prosecutor has, because doing justice is sometimes seeking the highest penalty for a particularly heinous crime for reasons that are, appropriate in that case. And doing justice is sometimes dismissing a case outright where, letting it go forward would somehow be unjust or destroy somebody's life or, their extenuating circumstances and everything in between. And that's what an elected prosecutor does, is you set the policy and the tone of these are the prosecution priorities of this office. These are the things that will be deprioritized in order to best use the resources of Hillsborough County voters in order to fight the kind of crime that would negatively impact their lives. And that focused prosecution is what I would like to bring to the office, is really going after the important stuff and figuring out what's the best use of the resources, what's the best use of time, and in what way do the people of Hillsborough County get the most value out of that office and having a safe community with good relations between the public and law enforcement.
So what would the Hillsborough County Attorney Nicholas Sarwark, what would his position on Granite Hammer be? And if you're not familiar with Granite Hammer, it's gone through several names since it was adopted 4 years ago.
Okay.
It then became Granite Shield and then went to something else. And now I forget exactly what it is. But there was something in the paper recently where they busted a bunch of people just for simple possession under this thing that was supposed to go after opioid dealers. And
is it a federal partnership or is it a state? So it's the state of New Hampshire and Hillsborough County working together.
Yep. It was supposed to go after opioid dealers. Right. And when it was going through the legislature, one of the Democratic members of the General Court offered up an amendment to the bill to direct some of the funding to go towards treatment.
Right.
And that was shot down, and the speaker said, that's not the point of this. We want to get opioids off the streets, but we don't want to actually provide treatment for anybody. We just want to arrest our
Right.
way out of this. And now they're moving from dealers to anybody that's possessing some of those that only have cannabis. So would Nicholas Sarwark move to proceed with those prosecutions, or would you seek to offer some plea deals on those?
What I would seek to do is try and get to the underlying problem. You know, if you have somebody who is constantly being picked up for simple possession of something like meth, that's because they have a meth problem. You know, they are possibly self-medicating for something, or they're experiencing homelessness, or something's going on in their life where meth is making sense to them right now. And if you don't get down to that root cause of why is it that meth makes sense to this person, you're going to have a revolving door where they're going to pick up a charge. They're going to go into jail or prison for a while. They're going to come back out. They're going to keep using meth. And it's a waste of taxpayer resources, honestly, because housing people is more expensive than treating them. And you should really save those jail beds or those prison beds for people who are committing violent or property crimes, where it is more dangerous to the community. You know, there is a danger. You know, I don't want to sugarcoat it. There are negative effects from having a lot of people who are substance abusers living in your parks, living in your neighborhoods. There is bad stuff that comes from that. But priority-wise, that's below stuff like sexual assault or, you know, burglaries where people are breaking into houses, or carjackings, or, you know, things like that should get a higher priority. And some of these quality of life issues, we really need to look at what other resources outside the criminal justice system can solve the root cause of this so that we don't see those people anymore. And so, you know, what I would want to look at is something that at least provides an opportunity to somebody picked up for an offense like that to look at, let's try this other way, see if it works. If it doesn't work, you can always go back to the way that you normally would prosecute that kind of crime, but give them an opportunity to kind of straighten up and move on with their lives in a productive way, instead of dropping another charge on them and another conviction that's only going to serve to make it harder for them to reintegrate into the community as, you know, a normal, productive member of society.
And we can talk about the racial disparity in drug incarcerations and convictions, but it sounds like, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, sounds like you might be in support of drug court and expanding drug court a little bit.
You know, specialty courts I've seen them work really well. I did do some drug court work when I was in Colorado, but that wasn't my regular assignment. But from my colleagues, they were saying that it was producing better outcomes. And I think I would look at any sort of specialty court that can produce better outcomes for the citizens of Hillsborough County. Because one of the things that you have to do as a prosecutor, you're supposed to provide equal justice without fear or favor to everyone. And that justice isn't just to, you know, the taxpayers or, you know, the elected officials or the police, or, you know, it's also towards the people who have hit the criminal justice system and are defendants. They are still citizens of Hillsborough County. And you have to try and provide that justice where everybody gets better. You don't, you know, take it out on one part of the society for the other part of the society. And so if there are specialty courts that can help with either, you know, mental health issues, you know, veterans have some distinct issues, and there's been some good results with veterans courts that I've seen in some other jurisdictions, drug courts, you know, some type of pretrial diversion program where there's the ability to hit the snooze button on a case and say, look, if everything goes okay for 6 months, maybe we just let this go. And, you know, you get back with your life, we get back with our life. Nobody has to go to jail.
So
you know?
that sounds kind of like placing it on file. That's what they refer to it in New Hampshire, of if you,
Right.
you know, you don't really have a history of any violence. So what we'll do is, as long as you're a good boy,
Right.
for the next X amount of time, it goes away.
Yeah.
Or they might suspend the sentence of, all right, it's a 1-year sentence. We'll suspend it for 2 years of good behavior.
Right. Well, and one of the things that's beneficial for doing that is those kind of cases that have a pretty clear resolution, where the deputy prosecutor and the public defender or the criminal defense attorney who's representing the defendant can get together and say, this is kind of the severity of the case. This is a just outcome where, nobody gets everything they want, but it moves society forward. It moves our community forward. Getting rid of those cases allows those deputy prosecutors and those criminal defense attorneys to go work on the really serious cases, right? It allows better justice in those cases that do have to go to trial because there is a serious dispute, or because, somebody just wants to exercise their constitutional rights. Let's try and be focused in our efforts, because if everything's important, nothing's important. And so I want to make sure that the Office of County Attorney has some clear priorities that match with the values in Hillsborough County, so that this community can be even better than it is right now.
And now let's get into, and I've got questions about how you would handle certain ongoing issues, specifically related to the COVID, because courts have been shut down for 3 months, roughly. But let's talk about the racial disparities, specifically as it relates to cannabis, which in New Hampshire is not legal for recreational use. It is only legal for medicinal use, and you've got hoops and hurdles to jump through to qualify for that, which means that New Hampshire is an island of prohibition. The ACLU earlier this year issued a report showing that African Americans are 4.1 times more likely than whites to be arrested for cannabis-related offenses, even though multiple studies show that demographics, across the board, white, African American, Hispanic, everything else, uses cannabis at about the same rate. So how would Attorney Nicholas Sarwark want to handle, and I realize that a lot of this is outside of the attorney's job, but how do you think this should be best handled to eliminate that disparity?
Well, I think one of the things that you do as county attorney, you want to have a good relationship with the police chiefs in the county, which I believe it's either 29, it's 26 towns, and I want to say two cities. So maybe it's 28. I'll find the right number eventually.
I'll find the number while you're talking.
It's the fact remains that it's good to have a talk with the chiefs and figure out what their law enforcement priorities are, figure out what your prosecution priorities are, and try and have an understanding of these are the sort of cases that, we consider to be a high priority at the county attorney's office. Those are the kinds of cases that we think you should focus policing on. Obviously each jurisdiction, that chief gets to tell their officers what they want to do. From a county attorney's perspective, anything that is like cannabis possession, something that would be legal somewhere else but isn't legal right now in New Hampshire,
yep,
that's kind of the lowest prosecution priority for an office that I would be heading, because there's not a lot of benefit to society from it. This is something that is, almost gonna be legal soon, and it's not worth the paperwork. It's not worth the tax dollars. We should be spending that money prosecuting the guy who stole somebody's bicycle, or prosecuting the person, that beat somebody up over, lunch money or something. We should not be going after something minor like that. And that lets us focus those resources on things that make you feel safer. And so if there are law enforcement agencies in Hillsborough County that have been padding their stats or doing a lot of pretextual stops for cannabis, we'll have a conversation about that with the chief and just let them know these cases aren't really going anywhere. They're going to get disposed of pretty summarily unless there's some really interesting extenuating circumstance. You look at every case, as its own thing, but they're not going to turn into a bunch of overtime hours testifying at trial or anything like that. So, let's all try and get on the same page as best we can. And I think that dialogue is what's important, and making it clear, those clear expectations going into it. I think that had that happened with the previous county attorney, maybe things wouldn't have gotten quite to where they did.
Yep.
Those relationships are important, even if you're going to disagree, right? Even if a chief's going to say, I just want to go this other direction, that's fine. It's better that we know where everybody's sitting, where everybody's standing. And, it's different jobs in the system, right? Everybody's got to do their job as best they can. And we all have a role to play. And, one of the advantages I think I have, having practiced as a public defender, is I have a sense of what it's like to be on that other side of it, and more, understanding of the whole criminal justice system, that I think will help bring a better quality to the practice of criminal law in Hillsborough County, which I think, most attorneys would probably appreciate.
So we do have a question from the audience that I'll get to in just a second, that is tangentially related to what I wanted to ask about the ongoing COVID situation, where courts are closed, have been for almost 3 months. A lot of cases are being delayed because of it. For example, a traffic citation that my lovely wife received in August of last year. And this is the question that she has about her ticket, where without going into details of why the registration was expired on the second day of the month and why she was unable to get a New Hampshire driver's license, she got that ticket August of last year. Still has not gone to court. She's had a couple of court dates, but due to some illnesses and other things, there's been 2 delays, and then court has been closed. So for all of these traffic cases that have been delayed since March, and we have no clue when they're getting hearings, would County Attorney Nicholas Sarwark just summarily null pros all of those?
I don't know. What I would do is take a look at the backlog. And that's part of that's part of the practice of running an office administratively, is looking at case aging, looking at case loads among line deputies, figuring out, who's getting the job done, who's not getting the job done, if there's something about a particular court or a particular judge or a particular defense attorney or something that is causing an anomalous pattern, figuring out how to solve it. So if there are a bunch of stacked up traffic matters, and that's something that can get resolved, that's one thing to look at as an option. Unfortunately, if it's somebody that I know, ethically, I wouldn't even touch the case. I would have somebody else deal with it, because, my legal ethics generally,
there's a
good personal
legitimate,
ethics. You don't
legitimate conflict of interest.
You have somebody else take a look at it who is outside of your line of control, or has, full autonomy to handle the case as they see fit, because that is important. This not having fear or favor, one of the things that happens structurally in our system of criminal justice that, should change at some point, I don't know when it will change, is you have the elected county attorneys in a jurisdiction are the ones who determine whether or not to prosecute, say, a member of law enforcement if they're involved in what is potentially a criminal act. And our system right now, that's how it works. Well, there's a clear conflict of interest in that relationship. If you're working with an office all the time, if you have that person testifying in all your cases, and then you're looking at whether or not to prosecute them for a crime, that's difficult to do dispassionately. And if it was on the defense side and you had multiple defendants who all were involved in the same crime, one person would get the public defender, and then the other people would get alternate defense counsel or conflict counsel, they're sometimes called, because each individual client might want to point the finger at their co-defendant. And so it would be a conflict for one attorney to represent all of them, because you couldn't, yet you'd have to pick, you can't play favorites. That's not possible to do. And so I think one of the things that our system could really use is that recognition that there is a conflict, and having special prosecutors who come from the private bar, who aren't even part of law enforcement generally, to be the prosecutor for a case where there's a conflict like that, so that they would pursue justice without fear or favor, without putting their thumb on the scale. Preferably somebody from outside the jurisdiction, so that there's not even that sense of, camaraderie. That would go a long way toward dealing with some of the problems that people have with the justice system right now, is that sense that it isn't in fact impartial, that it isn't blind to things like race or class or, quality of defense, or a lot of different structural things that are in it. We try to have an impartial justice system. We want justice, but we also have to recognize when there are structural things that need improvement. At a minimum, as an elected prosecutor, you try and help your staff understand where those biases can come from and try and be aware of them. But, to the extent that lawmakers can in the future change some structure, that's a better solution long term.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the actual process of how not necessarily the specific court hearing, but let's say Darryl gets a traffic citation or arrested for possession of, let's just say 7/8 of an ounce, which is just a hair above what is decriminalized in New Hampshire.
So you're into the criminal weight on a cannabis charge.
So I would, and it's not the felony level, so it would just be misdemeanor.
Right.
So we don't have to go through, whatever the felony process is. That's much more complicated than misdemeanor. But even with a violation, there's still the process of you have your arraignment.
Right.
Where in a lot of cases, the prosecutor is going to offer a plea deal.
Right.
If you plead guilty, then we'll do X. If I say no, then we go to a pretrial conference.
Right.
Where the judge looks at a little bit of evidence. Another plea deal is offered in most cases. And if I don't accept the plea deal, then ultimately down the line, there's a hearing.
Right.
Discovery happens where I get all the evidence that the prosecution has. Prosecution gets all of the evidence that the defense has. Witness lists are exchanged. And then in about 99% of cases, another plea deal will be offered just before the judge announces State v. Darryl W. Perry, where you did this against the peace and dignity of the state of New Hampshire. And if I turn down that plea deal, and then I make my argument to the judge, I then get hit with the trial tax.
Right.
Where you wind up facing a much harsher penalty than if you would have accepted any of the plea deals that had been offered beforehand. I realize that it's not something that the attorney could handle, but if a group of attorneys, per se, were to go and lobby the state legislature, do you think that the legislature might want to act on taking care of the trial tax? Or would they hide behind their shield of the legislature doesn't get to tell the judiciary what to do?
Right.
Despite all of the other statutes that implement mandatory minimum sentences that are telling the judiciary what they have to do.
So, one of the things that could be handled legislatively, I'm not going to comment on the wisdom thereof, but the way that you would solve the problem that you're stating, right? This problem that if you're convicted at trial, you end up with a sentence that's harsher than what they were going to offer you to plead guilty to the charge. The way you would resolve that is you would pass a law that capped the sentence, if convicted at trial, at the heaviest sentence that you were offered at any plea deal prior to trial, right? So that that would, one of the things legislators are going to look at is say, they're going to look at that and say, that's going to incentivize him to go to trial because he can't get any worse penalty by going to trial, and it's going to take plea deals out of the system or make plea deals less attractive because part of the reason plea deals work is they are better than what is likely to happen to you at trial. That's, you're giving up a constitutional right, you should get something for it, and usually what you get is less time in jail, less time on, you know, some sort of supervision, lower fines, lesser offense on your record, the dismissal of charges, you know, not indicting your wife or your girlfriend or whatever. There's a lot of things that are offered and accepted in the plea bargaining process, and capping what can happen at trial to what the plea was, it would not make the system more efficient, but it might make it more just. There's a guy named Clark Neely at the Cato Institute that, you know, has basically suggested if that prosecutor was going to let that person out on the street with that penalty and that charge, what changed about them going to trial, right? That person still committed that act, and you still thought that was worth that kind of penalty in order to, you know, properly deal with it in a just way. Why is it more just because they exercise a constitutional right? And that's a question that lawmakers really should ask themselves. And it's a question that you have to think about, because our system of justice in this country is heavily dependent on plea bargaining. And
Yes.
so that's the problem with structural change. And the reason people don't like to talk about it too much is it really does change everything. It would change some assumptions we have about how the world works. And that's uncomfortable for a lot of people. And one of the things that helps to do is show concrete examples where there may be a jurisdiction where some of these, you know, more reformist criminal justice policies have been put in place, and you show them these are the results you get, right? Showing people is always better than telling people to convince
Yes.
them. And one of the things that I've seen as far as cannabis legalization across the country is looking at the vibrant, thriving economy of Colorado and Denver and that whole Front Range corridor, the number of startups, the amount of venture capital, the amount of, you know, people moving in and home prices rising and having an actual increase in population when other states are having a decrease, an increase in the tax base when other states are facing recessions. You point to that and then you say, oh yeah, and the violent crime rate went down, and the opioid use rate went down, and the DUI rate went down. At that point, you know, you're not really having an argument about whether or not it's the right thing to do. The only people who are resistant at that point are people who don't want it to be better because they're very attached to how the system exists. And that's okay. But I think the vast majority of people, when you show them that this policy works better for them and their kids and their family and for their community and for the, you know, the house prices in the county, they're on board with it, right? People only want to do stuff that works for them. And I think a lot of what we need to do as candidates is help explain, you know, we don't try and get people over to believe everything we believe about the world. But what we can do is show them how an existing program or an existing policy isn't doing the thing that they want it to do. And so we start out by being helpers and saying, if you want to subsidize housing, for example, for lower income people, this is a better way to do that will cost less taxpayer money and have less overhead and actually work better to alleviate homelessness, right? This will solve the problem. We may not get to the point of we're going to totally, you know, get rid of the program, but we can at least point out the way we're doing it now isn't working in these ways. This would be better for what you want to accomplish. And I think that's where we build credibility, and that's what starts that dialogue where later down the road, our colleagues are willing to listen when we propose something that's a little bit a bigger structural change. They're willing to hear us out because we were trying to help them solve their problems first.
Right. And I'm glad you touched on, and you didn't exactly say housing first, but you did touch on that. And that would go a long way towards solving a lot of the problems of some of the low-level
it helps you find the other problems.
Issues.
I mean, the thing about housing first is it's got its ups, it's got its downs. But if you take care of the housing situation with someone who is experiencing homelessness, you get to figure out what the other problems are. because you can see them outside of that, transient kind of on the street
Right.
zone.
So and I live right across the street from Veterans Park. So I see, homeless camps all the time, except for the brief period last fall and over the winter where they were shut down. But one of the complaints is they are always drunk and on drugs. Well, let's look at people that live in the luxury high-rise apartment on the corner of Bridge and L in downtown Manchester. How many of those people like to have a glass of wine before they go to bed, probably take an Ambien or some other sleeping pill, but they have this luxury apartment. They've spent hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on a mattress. They have just the right pillow. They've got a climate controlled environment that they live in. And when they wake up in the morning, they have a big cup of coffee, probably a Frappa Mocha Latte Chino. And that helps them get through the day a little bit. So you have people that are using drugs, but it's different because the drugs that I'm using, they're legal. And the people that, don't have all of these accommodations, they're probably drinking to help sleep a little bit because they're experiencing chronic fatigue. They might be using a substance to help them get through the day because they're dealing with situations that they shouldn't be dealing with. I'm sure you're familiar with the rat park experiment, where some people looked at it and they're like, see, rats will just use as much cocaine as they want to, and then they wind up dying. But rats, like humans, are social creatures. And when they built this fun little playground park for the rats and let them hang out with all their little rat friends, but still had access to the cocaine, the rats were using less cocaine because they weren't trapped in a little box completely isolated. So, this kind of ties into the housing first, not that I'm necessarily saying we need to implement housing first next week, because we can't implement it next week. But if we did, it would take care of a lot of the underlying problems of a segment of the population for this one particular issue.
So not to dive too deep into your specific example, because it went kind of down a weird spot for me, but I'm good with it. There's two things that are important. One of the things that you learn working on the defense side of the criminal justice system is the best way to represent a client is to look at the client as a whole person,
yes.
Right? All of the aspects of their life, not just the case that's in front of you and the charges that are in front of you, because that's going to determine what is a good outcome for them, right? And it may be different for different clients. Some clients do well on probation. Some clients really would rather just do the time. And you have to know what are their priorities, things like that. Right. So from that way of looking at the whole person, if more of the government agencies that interact with people would try and incorporate those techniques, you could get better outcomes without changing anything else about the system. Just having people be inquisitive a little bit about what else is going on in your life to identify pitfalls. But looping back to housing first as a method for dealing with a homelessness issue or even with a drug abuse homeless encampment issue is housing first at least puts people off the street, right? So they're not interacting with the public. And that takes care of one of the biggest issues that most members of the community have with homelessness is they don't have particular animosity towards homeless people for the most part. For the most part. What they have is a real discomfort with having homeless people in public spaces that they don't want to see homeless people in, right? Basically, it's creating these interactions that they don't want to have. Housing first at least deals with that aspect of it no matter what. Even if nothing else works from that point on, they're at least someplace during the day where they're not out in the park or they're not on the sidewalk, they're not panhandling. That's a start. But it goes so much further, because once you get people in a stable housing situation, you can then identify how much of their behavior is related to the drug use or the mental illness or the financial problems for not having a job or the stress over losing a wife or a husband to COVID. You can start breaking down what's going on with this whole person when you've isolated one of the problems and made it no longer a problem. And it's not that expensive to do. And there are a lot of private funders out there who will fund it. The experience I've had before with municipalities and in doing these kind of projects is it's really getting through the city government or the county government to get the permitting for it, because there's a real lack of trust. The community doesn't trust that the people who are running these nonprofits are going to have appropriate security or going to have appropriate, controls to make sure that they're not creating a problem. And I think, one of the things that needs to happen is a lot more people need to talk to each other. And that's not just for this, that's for every issue. Even people that I don't agree with, I try and be able to talk to them, because if you understand where they're coming from, yeah, you're still going to have some arguments, but there'll be better arguments because you really understand where they're coming from. You're not just reading it from your own media stream where, you believe something about what other people believe. That's a real problem we have in our society right now, with how a lot of the media is such a bubble that it presents this idea that those people think this or those people do that.
Right.
And it's dangerous to do that. Really, you need to talk to people and find out what they really believe.
And I've noticed, and I'm not sure if this is your experience as well, but I've noticed a genuine lack of honest conversation between a lot of people. Even when there are conversations that are happening, it's still not coming from a place of good faith, where people want to intentionally misinterpret what the other person is saying.
It's lazy politics is what it is, because it's always easier to throw up a negative piece on your opponent and, twist a word or take something out of context and just hammer them with the people that, you need to dislike that person. I mean, politics is politics, right? So that stuff's around. But if you're good and you actually know what you believe and you're really in tune with the community and you've thought through your policies, you don't have to misrepresent your opponent's policies in order to criticize them, right? I didn't misrepresent the incumbent county attorney by saying he didn't have experience in criminal law prior to getting elected. As far as I know, that's absolutely true. He may be a great guy, but that's a fact. That's a differentiation in a political race. That's all fair and good. And I wouldn't misrepresent anything about his record. And I would anticipate, that all the people in this race are going to represent each other fairly in their communications, because we all actually have ethical obligations as attorneys to not make false or misleading statements, not only just to the tribunal, but in our general business dealings. Like, that's, members of the bar are called to a profession, and we hold ourselves up to those standards, right? The bar is a self-regulating entity. The lawyers take care of the other lawyers and make sure that the bad lawyers either get it right or don't get to continue being part of our profession. And that is something I take very seriously, and I trust that all of my opponents take it seriously enough that no one would engage in that kind of negative attacks or, making things up.
So I've got a question about the bar. So remind me to ask that, but I want to loop back to something that you mentioned a few minutes ago about being able to look at the whole person when they come up for any kind of charge. And a lot of times you see, if you ever go into the circuit court when they're open, you'll see a district attorney with just like this big, huge, thick stack of files, and they're just going through like a whole bunch of files, and it really looks like they're overloaded, where they might do 10 cases in the morning and another 10 cases in the afternoon, and there's several public defenders. So how much of not being able to look at the whole person has to do with overworked public defenders, in addition to just the, large number of cases that wind up going through court, many of which shouldn't be illegal in the first place?
Well, I think that sort of taps into it. Most people in the criminal justice system, both public defender and prosecutor side around the country, carry more cases than really they ought to. Caseloads are up all around the country. And part of the problem is that we prosecute too many things and we punish things too harshly in this country. As a general rule, that's not me commenting on a particular law,
Yep.
but just overall, we incarcerate more people in this country and we incarcerate them for longer periods. And the science on recidivism and, the effects of longer incarceration sentences doesn't show any clear correlation between long sentences and lower recidivism rates that isn't explained out by people just age out of crime. So once you're over 35, you're dramatically less likely to reoffend. There's a stability that comes with age. There's some hormonal changes, but there's good data on it. So if you have cases that either are not prosecuted or are routinely disposed of with a diversionary program that, goes well for most people, or they're turned into citations, and just as a matter of course, that clears up a lot of the cases. In the last jurisdiction where I practiced criminal law regularly, not driving with insurance was well known to be, if you came into the next pretrial conference with your insurance card, they dropped the charge because all they wanted was for you to get insurance.
So basically, what I've heard referred to as a fix-it ticket.
A fix-it ticket, yeah. And see, this is the bigger question I think we as a country need to be asking is it efficient to use trained law enforcement officers, highly experienced and often well-paid attorneys and judges, and all of the trappings of the criminal justice system to do highway inspections or to do, car safety inspections, or to stop people from using cannabis instead of, alcohol or cigarettes, right? Is that the best way to solve that problem? Even if you want to solve that problem, couldn't you actually afford a lot more just, car insurance citation people, or, neighborhood guys that go around the neighborhood and tell you not to litter, right? Is there a better way to solve the problem that doesn't take these awesome trappings of our criminal justice system and apply it to solve problems where there's just a ton of overhead, right? Because you paid a cop to arrest that person or give them a citation. You paid the clerk, you paid for the judge, you paid for the public defender, you paid for the county attorney, and
You're probably
over you're driving without a headlight. Maybe let's just not even go that direction. Maybe let's take some of those things out of that area of the law and, put them somewhere else, put them in the inspection side of it, right?
And depending on the jurisdiction, depending on the jurisdiction, you might have to pay the police officer overtime to go to court to possibly testify against the person that they wrote the ticket to.
Right. It's better to, if you're going to have an enforcement mechanism, look, everybody's got these license plates, right?
Yeah.
So if you see somebody, if an officer observes something, have some department, send a letter to the owner of that thing that says, hey, we saw this, you're on notice. If it comes up in our system that, you haven't repaired it, or you haven't written us back with picture that it's not a problem anymore, then next time you're going to get pulled over, right? Even something like that is a pretty simple thing where, yeah, you want people to comply with these safety regulations because we all want to be safe, but is it worth a police officer's time when they could be out investigating some other crime to fix brake lights and taillights and headlights and, rusty rocker panels and, all these things that really in our system end up just turning into pretextual reasons why an officer can interact with a person driving down the road and potentially find evidence of some other offense that can turn into an arrest. Like,
Right.
that aspect of how our criminal justice system works is one that I don't think a lot of citizens really like. You know, the most law-abiding, buttoned-up Republican, you know, sober as a judge doesn't like seeing a police officer turn on their lights, right? They're not interested in having that interaction. They didn't want that interaction. This isn't like a firefighter where they called and said, hey, can you send out a guy with a gun to make sure that I, you know, got all my lights fixed? Nobody wants that. So the only reason we do it is it produces revenue, which then pays the salaries of the people who do it, which then produces revenue, which pays the, and
Right.
and so what we have is kind of a self-licking ice cream cone in traffic enforcement. And we have to ask ourselves, is that something that the rest of us want, or is that only beneficial inside that tight little wheel of traffic ticket revenue, police officers, courts, all that? And would we be better off as a society to maintain the halls of justice for actual crimes that are serious and something that, you know, if you or I saw as just a person, we would try and stop and even potentially use force to try and stop? Those are things that should be handled by law enforcement. Things where you go, yeah, you know, you really should fix your headlight. I don't know as I would try and stop somebody or use force to make them fix their headlight. I might think less of them. You know, I might not ride in their car because it's not safe, but, you know, do we have to bring the police into it, right? Is there something that they could be doing that would be a better use of their time?
Yeah. So let's, we're getting low on time.
Okay.
I'm not sure if you can stay after 7, but, you know, 30 to 60 minutes is what I plan these things for.
Yeah.
Want to ask real quick, and I realize that this is outside of what the Hillsborough County or any county attorney can do, or any district attorney. But you mentioned that the bar is a self-regulating organization. So the American Bar Association, and I don't know if it's 50 chapters.
The ABA is the ABA is more of a trade group. It's a weird thing, but the bar itself in each state admits people to the practice of law, and it is self-regulating, although usually administered by the Supreme Court of the state.
Right. So that's kind of my question, where it seems like the bar is kind of a private organization that has gone to the state and said, anybody that wants to do X has to be a member of our group, and we only let certain people join our group.
Correct.
And I'm not sure if you've seen some of the information, and I just got something that says I have a ton of questions on the Facebook live stream. Jackie, if you can copy those and paste them in the Zoom, because that's the only one that I'm monitoring. And if you're in the
we'll see if we can get it in 5 minutes.
Facebook or the YouTube, I should have mentioned this earlier. I only monitor the Zoom. I do apologize for not being able to monitor all outlets plus carry on the conversation. And I don't have a fancy producer. So to get back to the question, I'm not sure if you've seen some of the information that's come out recently about in some states where South Carolina specifically came up in the news, where the bar back in the late 1800s was created to specifically exclude African Americans from practicing law. So how do you sort of, and I'm not asking you necessarily to justify the existence of the bar and its racial histories, but how is the bar, being a private organization, saying nobody can do this that's not part of our group, different from, say, a group of plumbers saying nobody can put in a new sink in their house unless they join our group, and we're only letting our friends join our group?
I mean, all guilds are a restraint of trade in some way, and all restraints of trade of that manner have the effect of increasing the wages of the people who are in the select group because they have less competition. That's the nature of the thing, whether it's a union, it's the bar, it's the medical board, it's whoever. right? Whenever you're restricting competition, you're going to raise the prices that the people who are in the group can charge, and you're going to raise the prices that the consumer will pay because you have less competition. It's usually sold as the benefit is by having us regulate each other and, you know, look out for the high standards of ethical practice of law. We are basically vetting your attorney for you so that you, as a person unsophisticated in the law, don't get cheated by somebody who, you know, is a Better Call Saul kind of figure where they're just making flashy commercials, but they're not really very good at their job. You know, how much of that is still necessary in the modern age and how much of it could maybe be shifted to some other form, I don't know. It's an ongoing discussion within legal circles, but, you know, ideally the bar would be like everyone else, looking at changes to modern society and better communication and figuring out how can we be more efficient in the provision of legal services.
All right, so Jackie did post some questions here. Not sure how many we'll get through.
Probably two.
Probably.
Pick two.
Here's one that is basically a yes/no question. Does America have the most people in jail for nonviolent crimes?
I think so.
That was asked by Sherry Bedwell. Robert Daniel, who's one of our state rep candidates in Manchester, asked, many, myself included, believe that violent crime and drug use are conflated. If someone commits a crime while on drugs, the drug use is the root cause, and so that is what should be criminalized. What are your thoughts?
You know, I don't think that that's usually the case, that the drug use is the root cause of the crime. What is usually the case is that it exacerbates the crime, right? Like if you get into a fight with somebody.
Oh, and I read that wrong.
Okay.
He said myself not included.
Oh,
so
myself not
Robert
included.
isn't
Well,
like.
that's fine. In any event, there's this thought that the drugs cause the fight, but any of us who drink know that, you know, how you behave when you're drunk is still of a piece with how you behave when you're not drunk, right? It just amplifies and lowers inhibitions. That's typically the case with most intoxicants, is they change your behavior, but that's still pretty much you. And so
Yes.
you're responsible for what you do. You know, this is one of those things where you do look at the whole case and the whole person. And so maybe you do want a prosecutor that's going to look at it and realize that if there's this other crime, but drugs are involved, getting to the root of it is the way to move forward long-term, where this person is on the right path. You know, short-term, you might have to deal with the sanctions that are imposed for a violent crime, right? I mean, there is a level of responsibility, even if you were intoxicated, as long as you weren't involuntarily intoxicated by somebody else.
Yep. Nick, thank you very much. Robert, apologies on not being able to get to the other questions. But as far as, I'll just take a stab at this, the ability to prosecute elected officials for violation of trust and abuse of power and constitutional violations, I don't think we're close to that at all.
At this point, we're probably going to be dealing with just the day-to-day, you know, criminal prosecutions that come through Hillsborough County,
yeah,
and try and make that work better. And then, you know, maybe after that's all done, we can look at expanding the ambit of the county attorney's office.
Nick, real quick, how can people find your attorney campaign? Do you have a website, Facebook page?
So I have an Anodot account set up. I don't have the Facebook page or website set up yet, but I can take contributions. Those will be up soon. And I can have the donation link. I can send it to you if you want to put it in the comments.
Send the link. I'll put in the description on Facebook and YouTube.
Okay.
And again, Nick, thank you very much for coming on. Hopefully we have success in our lawsuit for ballot access relief, where we've got the hearing coming up in just under 3 weeks. And when I get home tonight, I'll be reading the 30-page memorandum of law that was submitted by the state's attorney today.
Fun times.
Nick, I'll send that to you as well if you want to get angry tonight.
Okay.
And enjoy some of the tasty, tasty beer that people got at buynickabeer.com. And I'll be back, not next week, I'll be here in 2 weeks because there may or may not be a national convention next week that I hopefully, if it exists, I'll be joining on Zoom. And again, darrylwperry.com/Zoom. Although, Nick, I think you said there was a problem with the link, so I'll look into fixing that. And these do stream on Facebook and YouTube. And thanks again, Nick, and everybody that joined. Have a good night.
Thank you.